Honestly, on most issues, they're whiny little punks, and they're clueless, and they just have this victim complex, and they're wrong, right?
You're not being progressive. You think you're being progressive. You think you're being high-minded. You think you're being intellectual, but you're just doing this broad-based smear of an entire group.
On most issues, they're whiny little punks, and they're clueless, and they just have this victim complex, and they're wrong, right?
You're not being progressive. You think you're being progressive. You think you're being high-minded. You think you're being intellectual, but you're just doing this broad-based smear of an entire group.
Because I've said openly, and I'll say it again because I don't like them. I don't like them.
Is there anyone out there who, in all honesty, can put their hand up and say, I am not a women's rights advocate? Very, very few people, I would imagine. And most of those few would be feminists who insist the term is not radical enough. Even the authoritarian men in highly religious developing nations, if asked, would probably say, yes, it's important for women to have rights, at the very least, the right to be protected. So the term women's rights advocate is pretty much a given at this point. Like food eater and warm-blooded tetrapod. You don't even need to ask. And if the question, are you an air breather, means, do you ever, have you ever, or are you ready and willing to breathe air, then the question, are you a women's rights advocate, means, do you ever, have you ever, or are you ready and willing to advocate for women's rights? And this question does not need to be asked, because of the overwhelming probability that the answer is yes. You can probably see where I'm going by now. There are people who have spoken out frequently and at length against laws and court decisions that allow men and boys to be sexually assaulted and parentally enslaved and falsely imprisoned by women.
I mean, they have a point on like divorce issues and stuff like that, alimony issues. So I'm with them on some issues.
Decisions that even allow women to get away with attempted murder against men. People I know who will passionately and devotedly fight against this, who will pursue the action, the definitive verb of advocating for men's rights. And yet many, if not most, of these people, if you ask them, you there, person who passionately and devotedly advocates for men's rights by definition, pray tell, are you a men's rights advocate? They will say no. Now, if you're like me and you have a very fastidious obsessive compulsion for this thing called the most basic functions of logic, you'll already notice that that answer is false. It is absolutely logically wrong. The only thing that can save it is intuition. There's some fuzzy logic once we get to the grey area. If you've smoked a quarter of a cigarette, maybe 5 times in your life, okay, maybe you're not a smoker. But if you smoke 1 cigarette a week, then you are a smoker. You're not a heavy smoker, but you are a smoker. Try telling me you're not a smoker, and I will explain to you how you are not being logical with your language. You are being intuitive because you don't like the word smoker. You probably don't like the word atheist either. But if you're not a theist, then you are an atheist. But just because you're an atheist, that does not mean you're an atheist plus. And just because you're a smoker, that does not mean you're a crack smoker. And just because you advocate for the rights of men, that does not mean you have joined a fucking cult. Just like if you advocate for the rights of women, that does not mean you've joined a cult. But if you join a cult that acts exactly like a cult at every level, even so far as calling itself whiteism, then you have probably joined a cult. If you advocate against the rights of men, while insanely convincing yourself that what you're doing is advocating for the rights of women, then by Jove, you probably have joined a cult. If I find you hacking a black man's head off and screaming equality, then I will be very surprised if you are not wearing an ominous conical hood. If I say to you, can men please have the same rights women have, and that bounces around your shriveled brain and gets spat out as everyone should hate women, then you have definitely joined a fucking cult. If I say free the infidels and all you hear is fuck the holy ones, then you are definitely in a fucking cult. If I ask people not to mutilate babies, and you consider it to be cultish behaviour of me to ask people not to mutilate babies, then it is because you consider it normal behaviour to mutilate babies, and that sounds rather culty to me. The fact that we live in a society in which by default everyone is a women's rights advocate and by default no one is a men's rights advocate sounds rather culty to me. It's just a very, very large, very, very old cult. The women's rights movement is a good thing, right? We're all agreed on that. And feminism is a bad thing. Most sound-thinking people are agreed on that. And many people have come to the conclusion that the men's rights movement is the equivalent of feminism. That it's just as victim-y and superior as feminism is. Okay, I'll play that card, shall I? Alright, the men's rights movement resembles feminism, so what we need to do is dismantle it. And in its place, build something for men that instead of resembling feminism, like this culty MRM does, build something that instead resembles the women's rights movement. Except it's for men. What do you suppose we would call it? That would be the men's rights movement, you fucking idiot. And then when we've built this new men's rights movement, we will get another wave of fucking idiots saying this is just male feminism. Every time we try to build the male equivalent of the women's rights movement, you ridiculous gynocentric dullards will come along and say, this is just fucking male feminism. It's cult-to-me, it's victim-y, get rid of it. And meanwhile, what happens to feminism? The label that doesn't describe an action of any kind. The actual culty, victim-y, take over the entire Western world bullshit. Nothing! It maintains its throne at the heart of every city. Because you, gynocentric dullards, keep giving feminists the impression that they are the equivalent of the MRM. You're enabling their underdog illusions that... delusions that they're just a handful of grassroots activists dotted across the world trying to keep innocent students out of prison, trying to keep families from being torn apart, and trying to keep babies in one piece, when that's what the fucking men's rights movement is. When feminism, in reality, is establishmentally in charge of history's most bloated empire, and everyone knows it. No matter how fucking polite we are, and no matter how apocalyptically tyrannical the feminists are, the moment more than 3 non-feminists come together and say, we have similar interests in advocating for the human rights of men, and we think maybe we should call that something so people know what it is we're doing, each and every one of you pseudo-intellectual fucktards goes, no, too culty! Like, fuck you, seriously. If men don't have the men's rights movement, what do they have? Nothing! It is the literal, functional, descriptive term for what men have to do to prevent these injustices from happening to other men. And if whatever men do to try and achieve these rights is something you will write off as a fucking cult, then how in the shitting crikey do you expect anything to change? So I can see why you're wary of labels that might associate you with a cult. Cults have a habit of academically invading a civilization and turning it into a bloated empire, doomed to collapse. It's happening now with feminism. So even if a particular shoe fits, you don't want to adopt a label that might associate you with a movement. A goal, yes, but not a movement. That's an important distinction, right? Goals and movements. For instance, ethics in journalism is a goal. A long-term goal with measurable details and foreseeable outcomes. The pursuit of an ethical journalism community is not a movement, it's a goal. For it to be a movement, there would need to be a significant sort of people mover, some kind of icon to work around, some kind of label, some kind of hashtag. What does it mean to join Gamergate? It means to tweet the hashtag. That's right, you join the movement the moment you send that tweet. And you join the men's rights movement the moment you say anything in favour of the human rights of men. Because that's what a movement is. It is that action you're making being introduced to the stream of other similar actions made by others. And that's what join means in this context. It means something you said now exists. You joining a movement simply means your actions have categorically joined, or do categorically join, with the actions of others because those actions are myriad. Is that why you don't like the term MRA? Because there are so many people associated with it now. Is that what makes it seem culty? The thousands of people who now readily identify as men's rights advocates. Are they putting you off? If it was 20 years ago and almost no one identified as such, would you call yourself an MRA because it's original and therefore not culty? Fuck no, you would not. Admit it. The same thing goes now as would go 20, 50, 100 years ago. You don't want to call yourself a men's rights advocate because it sounds like white supremacist. And you don't know what to say to the millions of brainwashed bigots who think men oppress women everywhere and always have. Well, thousands of people have got over this preconception and said, yes, we know that's how it sounds to people who are against human rights, but we don't give a fuck. We advocate for the rights of men. That makes us men's rights advocates by definition, and we don't give a shit what the hordes of psychotic language butchers do with those terms. We do not adopt labels when they are unhelpful labels, but nor do we eschew those labels when those labels exactly describe what we are doing. And they are the only available labels to describe what we are doing. Do you get what I'm saying? Are you a scientist? Are you a historian? Are you a mathematician? If your answer is, well, I can't use those words because they're too culty, so I guess I'll just... Oh shit, there aren't any other words for my job. Whoops, my job just got erased from existence. Do you actually get what I'm saying? I will not erase those terms from my lexicon or my identity for precisely the same reason that I will not erase those human rights from my moral conscience. I will not bend to the will of the misandry cult, like you are. I will not allow them to take the very concept of compassion for men and erase it not just from our language but from our moral discourse. I will not let them win by pretending I'm not advocating for men's rights. So when someone asks me, are you a men's rights advocate? I don't say no, because that's not good enough. Nor do I simply say yes, by the way, because that's not good enough. Because perhaps like you, I'm aware that in many instances they're asking a loaded question, which might as well be, are you a white supremacist? They're not asking what is your opinion on gender. They're asking, would you mind stepping into this chalk outline of Beelzebub I've just drawn for you? Because we all know that's what MRA means. When people ask me if I'm a men's rights advocate, I tend to say something like, well, I advocate for human rights rather than against them, if that's what you mean. Because I don't like the strategy of pretending I don't advocate for the rights of men when I clearly do. I don't like the strategy of being dishonest. I prefer the strategy of revealing the dishonesty of others wherever possible and apparent. And the great, great dishonesty of others is this religiously fanatical insistence that men have all the power and do not deserve human rights. And anyone who so much as admits to the noun formation of their advocacy must be in some kind of cult. Can you imagine a world in which human rights advocate is a demonized term? But if you talk about how great it would be to leave your province and not get shot, and everyone goes, what are you, some kind of HRA? Have you joined some kind of religion where people are human? Well, that world exists, probably in North Korea. It will exist in the West if the social justice warriors get their way. Because they very clearly find social justice more important than human rights. We're already halfway there. If you say it would be nice if men, like women, could have heterosexual intercourse at least once without signing an 18-year slavery contract, people will say, what are you, some kind of MRA? And in response, you would probably say, no, I'm not one of those people who advocates for men's rights. I'm just saying I think men should have those rights. Derp. See, there are people who do not advocate for men's rights. Most feminists and most mainstream people, I'd wager, are in this category. Then there are people who do advocate for men's rights, but are not willing to accept the noun format of that action. People who won't own their shit, basically. Then there are people who do advocate for men's rights and do not give a fuck if you call them what they are. Because they're not scared. They're not scared of what the media says about Gamergate, and they're not scared about what the media says about people who advocate for the human rights of men and boys. So, if you are directly involved in Gamergate, or any other movement, like, I don't know, that women's rights movement with which you're associated by default, and yet you tell me that you are not a men's rights advocate because you don't want to be associated with a movement or a label, then you are telling me a falsehood. And the truth you're accidentally revealing, in the case of Gamergate, for instance, is that you believe ethics in journalism is worth joining a movement for, but the human rights of half the population are not. So, despite the bite marks that will no doubt accumulate on my tongue, I will not try to insist on saying to you, you are a men's rights advocate, not even when what you are doing is by definition advocating for men's rights, because I understand that you have language biases, and so do the people by whom you are surrounded. But if I hear you advocating for men's rights, and then I hear you say I am not a men's rights advocate, then I cannot promise I will continue to bite my tongue, and I might just move on to my thumb. Because I have just heard you tell a falsehood, good sir or madam. You have erected a wall in between verb and noun that allows you to utter a falsehood to the effect of, I am not a word speaker. And until you can stop saying words to that effect, you should perhaps carefully review what you're defining as a cult, and indeed who is still, to some small degree, part of it.